Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. My name's Liz Nelson. I'm a director at the Tax Justice Network, working on tax justice and human rights. Before we begin the webinar proper, I just wanted to go through some of the housekeeping just to make the webinar a little bit more accessible, hopefully. So I wanted to draw your attention to the translation function. So some of the speakers will be speaking in different languages, so it's important that you use the button at the bottom of your screen to choose the language interpretation you need. If you'd like to see subtitles, click on the closed caption button, that's a CC, at the bottom of your screen to turn these on. And we will be having a question and answer session. Hopefully we might fit in two. And so there is a question and answer button where you can put your questions, and there is also a chat feature if you want to leave comments. The report that we're discussing today is on our website, and one of my colleagues is going to put a link to that report in the chat function nowish. So hopefully you'll see that. So fundamental principles of human rights include non-discrimination, equality, transparency, the imperative to do no harm. And measured against these, the estimates of tax abuse are revealed in the State of Tax Justice Report 2021, which we launched today in collaboration with the Global Alliance for Tax Justice and Public Services International, are both shocking and represent a catastrophic failure of rights. The report estimates that countries are losing $483 billion in tax to global tax abuse. 312 billion of this tax loss is due to cross-border corporate tax abuse by multinational corporations, and another 171 billion is due to offshore tax abuse by wealthy individuals. Now, the report emphasizes that the 483 billion lost a year could pay to fully vaccinate the global population against COVID-19 more than 3 times over. So cost of acquiring and delivering a full dosage per person is $17.20 as an estimated cost. The report also calculates that every second the world's wealthiest create immense harm by stripping countries of enough tax to vaccinate 1,000 people against COVID-19. That's every second 1,000 people could be vaccinated, or rather aren't. So while higher income countries lose more tax in an absolute number, their tax losses represent a smaller share of their revenues. Lower income countries, in comparison, collectively lose the equivalent of nearly half of their public health budgets. Today, I'm thrilled to introduce our first panelists who will help to set the scene and explore the damage done by tax abuse to economic and social rights and to the rights of frontline public workers. In a moment, we're going to have a short video address from Professor Attiya Waris, who's the independent expert on debt and other international financial obligations and human rights. I'm also especially delighted that we have with us Baba Ai, the Health and Social Services Officer from Public Services International, who will speak about health impacts and vaccine equality on decent work. And finally, we have an intervention from Dereje Alemayehu, Executive Coordinator of the Global Alliance for Tax Justice, who's going to reflect on the scale of tax abuse estimates, on the imperative of governments and of the global governance of tax more broadly to tackle corporate and wealthy individuals' tax abuse. But just first, something about Professor Attiya Waris and the mandate that she holds. She was appointed by the Human Rights Council and took up the function on the 1st of August this year. She is the only professor of fiscal law and policy in Eastern and Central Africa, and she's the first female director of Research and Enterprise at the University of Nairobi. She's also an observer at the UN Tax Committee. She teaches at the Law School at the University of Nairobi, has previously taught in South Africa, Rwanda, Malaysia, and the United Kingdom. So fair to say that, that human rights and tax justice are very much part of Professor Waris's DNA. On the mandate itself, it's there to sort of examine the unsustainability of year-on-year increasing debt. For many developing countries, excessive debt servicing has severely limited their ability to promote social development and provide basic services to create the conditions for realistic economic, social, and cultural rights. Debt servicing is, of course, exacerbated by a global failure to address cross-border corporate tax abuse and offshore abuse by wealthy individuals. The independent experts mandate offers the tax justice movement an important means of intervention, and we should collectively take every opportunity to support the work and work with the mandate. The mandate itself establishes really an opportunity for a deeper examination of the combined negative impact of regressive tax regimes, weak financial transparency, and rising debt on the most marginalized people in our societies. Now, the mandate does continue to evolve, and most recently in March this year, in a resolution adopted by the Human Rights Council, it began to include an examination of the negative impact of the non-repatriation of funds of illicit origin. We more commonly would call that illicit financial flows. We look forward to supporting Professor Waris through the duration of her term with our analysis of the scale and impact of tax abuse, and we encourage our partners and others listening today to add their expertise and support in the coming months as we continue our advocacy for tax justice. So let's turn to this short video address from Professor Attiya Waris.
Hello everyone, to wherever you are in the world today. It is a pleasure and an honor to be part of this discussion, and I am sorry I couldn't be there to listen in on the conversations this time around, but I look forward to engaging with you further. I have read the report and with great interest, and it has been a really good reading on my part. But I was asked to talk a little bit about the damage that goes to human rights from issues of tax abuse. And I think that it is a really big conversation, but it starts with the premise that rights require resources. And if we want to raise living standards across the world and make people's lives better than where they are today, then it is really important that we ensure that we are not involving ourselves in tax abuse. And there is an element of ethics that comes into it, of course. But of course, there is a history of where we've come from and issues of inherited systems. That means that very often people abuse less because they really want to abuse the system, perhaps, but more because they find themselves in a system they don't quite understand and are basically trying to find their way through it and live with it. And the words around issues of taxation continue to be very negative, and it's an important thing that governments start to take this seriously so that we change people from being non-compliant taxpayers into compliant taxpayers and willing to be part of what is a very important system in order that human rights can be achieved. In my new mandate as independent expert, tax is going to be one of the priorities. I'm looking at issues around the minimum tax debate and digital systems, but I will keep a constant eye on the evolving tax systems globally, as it is part of the section on international financial obligations of my mandate. And of course, I welcome contributions from everywhere in the world on issues that you think are critical, blockages that you're seeing at national level, regional level, continental as well as global levels, because I would be happy to try and see how to help as much as humanly possible. But I think it is also so important for people to understand how useful work is at the United Nations. The fact that you have focus on human rights means that the normal debate or discussion that taxation is, although yes, of course, part of state sovereignty, but is a power, can be called into discussions and can be renegotiated, because even when states take tax revenue from their populations, from their residents, it's very important that that money does get utilized well. And this is why human rights becomes such an important lens through which we should look at. And then that takes me to the issue of justice. And one cannot help but think of the African economist Khaldun, who talks about justice as being the underpinning of all fiscal systems, as you set them up, and of tax systems, of course. And I think it is so important that we pay great attention to the issue of justice and fairness as we are looking at systems across the world. I look forward to the report. I look forward to seeing reflections and reactions from across the world to the report. And I look forward to the next report as well. I thank you for your time and wish you all the best, and congratulations on the launch.
Thank you very much, Attiya. And again, apologises if we've had some difficulty with the sound. And to repeat, I think we will put Attiya's video on our website page so that you can review that while you're reading the report. Next, we're going to turn to Baba Ai. As I mentioned, the Health and Social Services Officer from Public Services International. Baba, I'd just straight away hand over to you.
Thank you, Liz. Well, the point of departure right now, we have over 254 million confirmed cases of COVID-19. That's over 250 million people, and more than 5 million recorded COVID-19 deaths. In fact, analysis by the WHO, by the Imperial College pointed that the deaths from COVID-19 might actually be upwards of 4 times more. But an often underappreciated aspect of these is that the pandemic response has had their impact on health systems, particularly in poorer countries. It has, and also largely because health systems are grossly understaffed. You have a shortfall of 18 million health workers projected by 2030, and that was before the pandemic. And you have monies, the amount in tax havens could pay for more than double the number of nurses alone required. So you have an overstretched health and care workforce. Programs such as regular immunization programs have suffered, reproductive health programs have suffered, and you have even, tropical diseases like malaria have shot up because the response has soaked up this. But this can be changed. The pandemic could be brought to heel with vaccination. It is not a silver bullet, but yes, it's one of the surest ways of rolling it back. And you've had 7.52 billion doses administered thus far across 184 countries. That's an average of 35.2 million doses a day. And 3.2 billion people have been fully vaccinated, representing 41.3% of the targeted global population. But behind these figures lies sharp inequity, which feed further into deepening social and health inequalities. 52% of the least wealthy countries have just 4.9% of their population vaccinated. And Africa, where a large number of these come from, has 4.4% are vaccinated. And this is at a time that most of the more developed, economically more developed countries have passed the threshold of 70%, with even Portugal, I mean, having 98% of targeted population vaccinated. It's within this context that you had the WHO Director General last month pointing out that, whilst you have, this groundswell of vaccine production, so to speak, that the virus is still moving faster because we are having mutations also. And the context within which he said this was that in response to these mutations, wealthier countries are also now giving booster doses, whilst poorer countries have still not been able to reach a significant extent, including for health and care workers. And one of the targets of the WHO, I mean, the first 100 days, and then by September and by the end of this year, to have health workers everywhere in the world vaccinated. That is not the case today. That is not the case today. And that's poorer countries are bearing the brunt of this. And the impact on decent work cannot be overemphasized. Workplace, occupational safety and health, not only for health workers, but health workers being on the front line, has been largely compromised. You also have freedom of association being delimited by governments, where unions have demanded, requisite protection, occupational workplace safety. You have had in Zimbabwe, 13 nurses were arrested for making such demands. You have seen arrests also in Malawi, in Nigeria, in Kenya. You have seen workers sacked because it is natural for workers to try defend themselves, and you have thus had industrial actions in not less than 86 countries, most of these in developing countries, as a result of wanting safer workplaces, and which with the low level of vaccination is for many a mirage. And also the aspect of the poor fiscal policy space for governments in developing countries is a very important aspect of it, because the health budgets cannot adequately provide for both vaccination and health programs that are suffering from this. The UNDP, WHO, and University of Oxford, for example, pointed out also that $38 billion that could have been added to the projected GDP of low-income countries with universal access to vaccines would be lost by 2020. So it's a bad situation then gets worse. We should also note the fact that this has greater impact on women, and in these countries you have large informal economies where the situation also gets worsened. So the trajectory of economic recovery as well as recovery in the health, in terms of the health of people, is been compromised largely because, to a great extent, because of vaccine inequity. Meanwhile, the different vaccine developers got money from governments to fund the development of upwards of 97% in the case of AstraZeneca. But it does not end at that. Moderna presents us with a case which the Dutch Foundation on Multinational Corporations, SOMO, describes as a triple whammy. On one hand, they got funding from government, public funding to develop the vaccine. On the second hand, the prices make it impossible to have universal access. And on the third hand, it is also using tax havens to avoid paying adequate tax, its fair share of the tax for the vaccines. It's selling to the European Union. So tackling this situation requires a number of policy trust, addressing the issue of tax justice, and also demanding the waiver of intellectual property rights, because all what the developers are doing right now, what you have is a situation of profit coming first by any means necessary, and putting people over profit requires taking drastic actions and demanding for the TRIPS waiver as well as tax justice to ensure universal access to vaccine, and thus addressing emergent and deepening health inequalities and worsening working conditions for health and all other workers. Thank you.
Thank you, Baba. That was really excellent. I mean, as well as the kind of draw-dropping statistics and data that you've shared with us, just a real sense of the complexity, the domino effect, the deepening of inequalities, and it's just a backward step in terms of any sort of sense of advancing on equalities. So that's really helpful. We're going to turn now to Dereje Alemayehu, who's, as I mentioned before, Executive Coordinator for the Global Alliance for Tax Justice. Dereje, I think you're with us. Oh, you are. Brilliant. Hello.
Hello.
Okay, so I'm just going to hand over to you for 7 minutes or so, and off you go. Thank you.
Thank you for us to be part of this work. It is the second time, the second edition, and it has a lot of valuable tools for policymakers in a very understandable way. It shows really not only the amounts estimations, but also the power structure behind the whole mischief that is happening in the form of tax abuse and tax dodging. So as this was being prepared, most of the mainstream media was celebrating that historical deal has been agreed by world leaders have agreed to a historical deal that is going to solve the tax problem, that is going to stop tax dodging, and I don't know how many adjectives have been used in this propaganda when the OECD, when the G20 agreed the new tax deal to reform international tax rules. But so what I want to raise today is, we know the figures, we know the mechanisms, we have also proposed solutions. Why are we not getting any? And in this sense, personally, I have been involved in the campaign together with TJN and other civil society organizations, where we campaign to stop the tax tax deal of the rich. When we launched a sign-on campaign, over 250 global civil society organizations across the globe supported our call to reject the tax deal. Why were we insisting on that? The first thing is, if you look at the process itself, it is obscure. Nobody knows how the negotiations take place. Participants of different categories always say there is a huge political pressure behind forcing countries to agree to this. Not less than the Argentinian finance minister was saying in one of the webinars prepared by ICRIC, that we are forced to choose between the bad and the worst. The Nigerian delegate to the OECD was saying, we are forced to choose between the bad and the ugly. So the only countries satisfied with this deal are Ireland and, of course, the United States. And you see at every speech, the U.S. Secretary for Treasury is thanking Ireland for being instrumental in reaching the tax deal, and it has to make us ask questions why Ireland is so happy with the outcome. So we have seen a lot of proposals, suggestions submitted by different actors from the global south, and as the Global Alliance called it, but OECD has become the Bermuda Triangle, where proposals, suggestions from the south just disappear, but where proposal suggestions from tax havens such as the Republic of Ireland are taken into consideration. Now there are 2 points here. The first is the so-called deal is not going to solve the problem. It applies to a very small section of multinationals operating in the world, and applies only to a small fraction of the corporations around the world. That is, the maximum amount in the scope of this reform are 100 companies. The arm's length principle, which is a key vehicle for profit shifting, will remain virtually intact for the overwhelming majority of transactions within the same business groups. The splitting of global multinational profit into residual and routine, I'm not going into the detail, is something intractable. So it is something that might bring some change on the margins by leaving the apparatus and the structure intact. Tax abuse will continue. Secrecy jurisdictions and tax havens will not be discouraged by this. Pandora Papers show that there is no change at all taking place in this area. Profit shifting will continue. So it is not bringing any neither structural or practical changes in global tax abuse. The second one is actually very threatening for the future, is also the binding dispute resolution mechanism that might come with it, which will be locking countries into an agreement which has no advantage at now, and which will damage future interests as well. So the so-called Pillar 1 will leave the problem unsolved, and the Pillar 2, by and on itself, agreeing to an agreed minimum global corporate income tax is a good idea, but it depends on what the agreed minimum rate is. ICRIC and other civil society organizations propose 25, which approaches the global corporate income tax average, but the agreement now puts it at 15%. Even Joe Biden at the beginning proposed 21%, but Ireland and the other profiteers of the current system were insisting on 12.5. So to accommodate their interest, it was brought down to 15. As you see, 15 is much closer to 12.5 than to 25. So instead of ending race to the bottom, this will start the race to the minimum. We have seen that already. Lobbyists are insisting that countries come to the 15, align their corporate income tax to 15% instead of keeping it at 25, and certainly the way it is happening now. And the most unfair aspect of this is the untaxed profit. The undertaxed profit will be taxed by the rich OECD countries, which are headquarters, because the agreement favors residence countries as opposed to source countries. And the European EU Tax Observatory estimates from this reform, rich countries might get 19% additional corporate and additional tax resources, where the developing countries at best get 2%. As is indicated in the report, in absolute figures, developing countries might lose less, but the importance is these are countries which cannot mobilize trillions like the US is currently doing by public through public borrowing. They are more dependent on the importance of corporate income tax in their tax mix is very high. Despite all this, they are going to get less from this reform than rich countries. So it is. There are two things, as I was trying to say. One is there is no immediate advantage that developing countries will get from this reform, and B, it will be damaging to their future interests as well. For example, now they have to agree to this, and they have to agree not to take unilateral measures to increase their tax revenue by taxing, for example, digital service, by introducing digital service tax. They get less from the whole thing, and they are now asked to stop taking unilateral measures to increase their tax revenue. So an international tax order that was to be reformed to ensure the right to tax of developing countries is ending by denying them the right to tax. So it is not because of some fetishism or that, but because the OECD, as this report amply shows, has a vested interest to keep the status quo. The multinationals involved in the mischief are headquartered in the OECD countries. Illicit financial flows, proceeds of tax abuse flow to these countries, a proportionally higher proportion flow to these countries. So they have vested interest in keeping the status quo or in opposing structural change and fundamental and sustainable changes in the global tax system. And they can just not be interested with leading the reform process. So, but what are they doing now? They are actually, A, not solving the problem in a fair manner, and B, preventing or blocking a process in which countries could address this issue within the context of the United Nations. The demand for the UN tax body for an intergovernmental process to agree to international tax reform is not a civil society demand. It is demanded by the G77. The number is misleading. G77, it is called G77 because there were 77 developing country members in it when it was created, but actually now it comprises over 130 developing countries which are members of the United Nations. That is about 193 members, out of which 130 are grouped in the G77. They have been asking for a UN tax body to lead the process of international tax reform. And now, as we now speak, the G77.
Yes? Can I just press you to come to a conclusion?
Okay, yeah, it is. Yeah. It is. I'm almost there. So even as we speak now, the G77 at the UN wants to put this on the agenda of the next UN General Assembly for the creation of a global tax body, and the rich OECD countries are blocking even the presentation of this issue at the UN General Assembly. So that shows you how the minority of rich countries is really interested in preventing solutions and in manipulating solutions for its own end. So in that sense, the figures here, and especially the impossibility of solving these issues as long as the status quo is dominated by the OECD, that is the message I get from this report. The figures are very disturbing, and the causes for maintaining this unfair system is also well known. So that is why we have to join now in the call for a UN tax body and an agreement, intergovernmental agreement on a UN tax convention to solve this problem once and for all in a sustainable manner. Thank you very much.
Dereje, thanks very much indeed. It sort of sounds from a low-income country point of view like the political compass hasn't really changed a great deal, but it'd be interesting to see the perspectives as we go through. And I don't know if Baba and yourself are around for the rest of the webinar, because there may be questions coming up that you could help us answer.